Hello and welcome to the third subpool. Here we have some familiar names and a surprisingly not that abusive pool, but here we have, up first, we have Floof against Drills. Floof is bringing a trio of unique ships, all of them rather aesthetically pleasing, with the heavy reliance on plasma cannons, if I remember right. This one, of course, being the exception with missiles, but some plasmas on the back, some rails in the front. Overall, a pretty solid fleet, and I kind of like this little cross shape here that Floof has created out of the flat cannons. On the other side, we've got Drills, who's using what appear to be... these things all have close-range weapons, so they're going to serve as sort of distractors, and hopefully that'll go well. Each of those discs should do a decent job of absorbing damage, whereas this will be the bulk of his damage output, where we've seen this sort of design from Drills in the past, and it worked out pretty well, but I think a lot of Drills' success is going to hinge on whether or not the big ship is able to stay in the protective bubble of all of its escorts. And so far so good. As you can see, it's hiding behind it and drilling pretty promptly into Floof's diamond. The plasma cannons on the outside are actually a really interesting trick. The ship will try to consistently orient itself toward the target, and so by putting your weapons more toward the exterior, you increase your vulnerability to flanking, but in a direct confrontation, you actually keep your weapons alive longer because the enemy will drill through the center in more or less a straight line, leaving the weapons on the exterior a bit more resilient. And yes, Braided Headman, sometimes the final pool is typically referred to as the abuse pool, because that's where we generally find the nastiest and ugliest abuse of game mechanics, and this one is nowhere near as bad as the usual ones are. But we saw a solid round one out of Drill's fleet, and the torpedoes on the side immediately lighting up Floof's triangle, or Floof's diamond. Floof unfortunately does not look like she's going to be walking away with this round. Tough break, but it's only the first match of the pool. There's still plenty of time for things to change. And yeah, Duke, I agree. It looks like Drills is bringing some pain. It looks like these dragonfly-looking guys, the tail, which I initially thought was missiles, appears to also be more torpedoes, which is a really interesting way of actually going about it, because it seems to orient itself pretty well. It's a rather nice design. I appreciate that. But it does appear we're going to see Drills taking the round in just a moment. The discs, it's also worth noting, have the blast pulsars, which, being an omnidirectional weapon, kind of do a pretty good job of intercepting incoming projectiles en masse. But next up we have Floof against Drills, or Floof against Husk. Husk is bringing another one of his order fleets. You can see his call sign spaced circles, and this is actually a newer design. I don't think I've seen one like that before. But only a handful of melee spikes. I think he's only got like 2 on each of the big guys. He is definitely relying on his cannons for his damage output, which is just fine. I feel like Floof is at a bit of a disadvantage here. A lot of Floof's damage output is going to revolve around brawling, and Sentinels tend to be very good at it. And between the spinning, the durability that is the Sentinel armor, and the fact that the Husk fleet just simply has more ships on the field, I think is going to give him all the advantages it needs. And I'm not really sure why, but Floof's missile ship seems to think that it needs to be in close range, when I'm very much inclined to disagree with its assessment. But sometimes the AI likes to make interesting decisions. And more or less as I expected, you can see the fleet from Husk kind of running away with the scoreboard. Hello, Grand Scheme. How you doing? And round 1 going to Husk. I can't imagine round 2 is going to be too much different, but I have been wrong before, at least once. Well, here's hoping no braided headman that you don't have to worry about the 5-minute rounds, because if you can build up a point lead in the 2.5-minute rounds, that'll go in your favor, although I suspect that probably isn't what happens. Something tells me all those little guys keep you busy. And Husk takes the match. So, up next we have Floof up against Lapsapnow. Laps, as I've mentioned before, is a YouTube content creator himself, and has done a whole host of reassembly things. I think his most recent series that he's been working on is actually tutorials on how to mod the game itself. If you're ever interested in dipping your toes into modding, I highly recommend it. But in the meantime, we see Laps's pretty standard brand of insanity. This guy, he's actually, because of those autocannons, he's actually going to do a lot more damage than it seems like, and the defense cannons that it has are surprisingly good. This guy is going to be very cheap. I don't think it's going to live long, but while it is alive, it's going to do a lot more damage than it would appear. Here we've got plasma cannons, railguns, all the South African spaced armor that Laps debuted in, I think, the last tournament. Although this is an affront to my sensibilities. Why are these not all facing at least somewhat? And then over here we've got the. I like what he's done here with the antimatters. How he's got some on the angles. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work out, but I suppose we shall see in just a moment. And yep, this is in fact a 3v3 fight. Although I do like that the antimatter ship and the ship from Floof have decided to break off and fight their own separate battle. Floof is getting the better of the left side of the screen, however, and Floof takes round 1. Yep. Gotta have some twisted tree line in our reassembly. Round 2 looking even more in favor of Floof. I'm fairly confident Floof is going to walk away with this round 2. Yeah, the beams might have been more effective if they were closer together. Personally, I'm not terribly fond of proton beams in general. They just never really seemed to be worth their cost to me. Yeah, you agree, don't you? But the proton beams never really seemed to be worth it, in my opinion. The game calculates all the values dynamically, but I think it overvalues beam weapons. And as a result, because of their range, they just cost too much, I think. Especially considering that they're a fixed mount. And yep, there is in fact a Doge. He's doing puppy things, running around, shaking his toys. You know how they do. This last ship from Laps trying to keep keep the game going, but I don't think it's going to be able to pull it off. It's relying on its missiles, drones, and antimatters, and the drones seem to be getting knocked out by point defense very quickly, and the antimatters are hitting too inconsistently to really make any damage sticky. So I just don't think Laps's last ship is going to be able to claw that point difference back, especially with Floof coming in for the flank. I do think the antimatters on the angle are possibly helping, because you can see that half the time it's just the angled antimatter firing. But this ship does seem to be trying its best, putting up a damn good show. Not going quietly into that good night. However, a 6,000 point lead is a 6,000 point lead, and so I think we're going to be seeing Floof take the match here in just a moment. And there it is. So up next we have Floof against Starficz. Starficz bringing some sort of tinker monstrosities. Now what's interesting about these is they actually have 4 guns on each of these ships. There's one with a very long barrel, one with a medium barrel, and there's 2 right along the outer flanks. We've seen dual gun was typically the most popular Tinkerl design. Then we've seen some tri-gun Tinkerl, and now we've got quad gun Tinkerls. So I'm interested in seeing how they play out exactly. We've got some more of these. These are more standard dual gun style Tinkerl, and some small distractors. They have tiny lasers and whatnot. They're mostly just going to run around and try to keep keep the enemy busy. Now the biggest guns on the ships on the quad gun chassis from Starficz, you can see are firing on an arc pattern. And the really useful part about that arc is that it makes the attack or the shots very difficult to dodge, and so tends to work out very well against smaller, faster targets. But it's also got the additional guns on the side and the shorter barrel, which will help it against more durable targets if they do happen to get close. They are taking quite some time to dig through the armor, and as you can see, the diamond from Floof managing to connect with one of Starficz's smaller ships. The Tinkerl have this neat trick where basically they're untouchable most of the time, but as soon as you get your hands on them, they're basically just evaporate. Right. As Starficz was saying in chat, the small side guns are basically just to help the AI aim. And one of the changes for this particular tournament is that Tinkerl generators have long been limited in their quantity, mainly because if you just allow Tinkerl to build whatever they want, they will people will end up just stacking a ton of generators, range mods, things like that, and end up with sniper ships that just fire across the map and never have any chance of retaliation. So in an attempt to balance it out, I've been placing a maximum number of Tinkerl generators on a ship, which essentially also caps how much firepower they can bring to bear. And round 1, as we see, going to Starficz. But I suppose for the bulk of the community, the generator limit was considered too restrictive, and so now that the generator limit has been pushed up just a little bit, Starficz is testing the waters, and it seems to be working out fairly well. Although one of Starficz's larger ships just got taken apart by the missile diamond. I think one of the bigger assets that Starficz has in this fight is the superiority of numbers. If his ships, as you see, or as you've seen a couple of times, if they get caught from the side, they don't generally fare very well. But but when you have the advantage of numbers, you tend to get caught from the side less and catch from the side more. And it's looking like round 2 will also be going in favor of Starficz. So next up we have Eyes of the Storm by Splinter. Splinter bringing farmer ships with some kind of mess here. He does have 3 shields on each of these, and I believe his primary armament is actually the missiles, but there are Bolsheviks buried in there as well. He has an array of shotguns that you might also be able to see that are all set to point defense. So this is going to be very interesting. I'm not entirely sure how this is going to go, but you can see the vomit of shotgun fire coming out of these things. It's actually a really neat looking visual effect, in addition to being surprisingly effective and really good at stopping incoming projectiles. But yeah, as they close into point blank range, you can see the shotguns and the Bolsheviks both lighting up Floof's ship pretty potently. A really solid submission from Splinter. He's been working on farmer fleets in general for a while now, and it's kind of showing, I suppose. But I think this is more or less the exact sort of insanity we were expecting from the Splinter submission. This is, after all, the men who give us green phosphorus and the Pulsar frigate. Off to a decent point lead, but I am wondering how this fleet is going to fare against some of the against the Tinkerel and the Sentinel submissions in the pool. That might pose a bit more of a threat, but we shall see. The ships from Floof seem to have a hard time trying to figure out how they want to engage. But that said, the Bolsheviks are actually very nice weapons. They're kind of expensive and relatively short range with very slow muzzle velocities. But when you are able to connect with them, as you can see, they really do devastate their target. And yes, Splinter also gave us B tier, where I don't know if he invented hyperstacking, but that certainly brought it to everyone's attention, where he was using thousands of the B point defense cannons in his fleet, to the closest thing the Bs have to an actual mid-range weapon. And yeah, Splinter, I don't know if you invented it or not, but your B-tier fleet is the first time I recall ever seeing hyperstacking. I had seen stacking before, but not to that extent. So it's entirely possible. But we did see Splinter take round 1, which, given the score lead, I don't think would be terribly surprising. And also a decent start in round 2, but you can see Splinter's fleet hemorrhaging a bit of points early as it tries to close in, but those Bolsheviks really are doing quite a bit of work. Splinter bringing the several months of frustration to bear. And yes, the B tier didn't quite force the time dilation rule. But it was on the list. The Pulsar frigate was on the list. There's a few of them. Some of the larger ships made out of just a ton of blocks will also cause the game to lag, and things of that nature. There's a bunch of interactions the game has trouble with, and so the time dilation rule kind of happened to try and keep the tournaments kind of flowing smoothly. And you can see, even then, still sometimes we do get a bit of slowdown. but it is nowhere near as bad as it used to be. And yeah, Splinter bestowing that farmer rage upon everyone else. Yeah, I believe if the shields are what's taking damage and not the armor itself, I think the armor can still regenerate, but I'm not entirely positive. In most cases, it's not a significant enough occurrence to really observe. And Splinter takes the match, earning a solid win with the farmers. Next up we have Flypaste, who I think he said he just threw these ships together in a couple of minutes. We got proton swords, some mine layers, plenty of thrusters, so these things are going to do some drive-bys and try to hug things. Let's see how that goes. Mine layers in the past have not been the most effective weapons, but Flypaste did bring proton swords, which I always emphasize never underestimating the potency of proton swords. They can and will very quickly turn a match around. And Flypaste takes round one with mines just everywhere. You can see the proton sword rushers working out very well. And the blast radius on mines is actually rather solid too. They're the only real problem is that they don't have any launch velocity. They just inherit the launch velocity of the host ship, which works out really well with Flypaste's design. Well, I think they might have just a little bit of their own, but they don't have any propulsion. So they just kind of drift forward for a little bit, but not very far. However, with Flypaste's fleet being full of charging laser ships, you can see the mines are actually connecting rather well, especially even when hugging. They're being put to pretty good use. Well done, very good showing from Flypaste's mine-laying ships. Normally mines have not been an impressive weapon. But now we've got drills up against Husk. Drill's bringing a lot of torpedoes to bear, which could be a problem for those spinners out of Husk's fleet. But at the same time, one of the torpedo ships from Drills decided that being surrounded by the enemy was a tactically significant plan, and I'm inclined to disagree. And Husk putting a very pronounced lead on the scoreboard here in the first round. The discs from Drills seem to be doing a decent job of keeping Husk's fleet distracted, but the main battleship from Drills is surrounded and being whittled down and killed, which, as I said before, as long as that doesn't happen, I think Drills' fleet will fare pretty well. But since that happened, now I think round one is just going to be Husk cleanup hour. The big guy really does need to stay near his escorts. And and speed this up a little bit. Unfortunately, when accelerating the gameplay through, the auto camera also gets messed up. It ends up just scrolling too far. But Husk takes round 1 rather solidly. Moving in round 2, we can see Drill's fleet unfortunately making some of the exact same mistakes, which does not bode terribly well. And the main ship from Drill's unloading its torpedo volley on a distractor, and because it didn't hit it on a particularly good angle, didn't even manage to kill the distractor. Pretty solid brawl going on in the middle, but again, that main ship being a little too brave. I think it's just too fast compared to the circles. I think if the circles were faster than the main ship, it might work out a little better. Or if they were all kind of homogeneous speed. But because the big ship is running up ahead of the smaller ships, it ends up surrounded like this. And like I was saying, having the cannons and stuff on the outside works very well in duels, but unfortunately it's not in a duel. It was flanked, and so it lost a lot of its damage output very early. As we can see, Husk spinners rolling in and bestowing great vengeance and anger upon the enemy. Unsurprisingly, a rather good fleet out of Husk, but I think we're going to be seeing Husk take round 2 here just shortly. Let's chase the Kiter Hour. And Husk takes the match. So up next we have Drills against Lapsapnow. Here I feel Drills has the advantage. Because Laps only has 3 ships, and one of them just got cut in half with torpedoes, the odds of the larger ship from Drills getting isolated and surrounded are drastically diminished. Which is basically exactly what Drills needs. Yeah, it's alright, Splinter. Laps typically uses like a blue on yellow pattern, whereas Drills uses yellow on blue. The orange is fairly new, I think, but it might be just a theme for this particular archetype. But yes, unfortunately, for Laps, we are does anybody feel like paying F to pay respects? Because I think this fleet needs it. I do agree. I really do like this this antimatter ship from Laps. It is particularly interesting looking. The big one kind of just looks like reminds me of the Hammer from the Hammer and Tongs fleet, except instead of a solid body of armor, it's the spaced armor. And the space armor is resisting the explosive damage pretty well, especially given the weight of it. But Drills' main ship, with all those plasma cannons, just eats through it Now we have the antimatter ship trying to be a hero yet again. I think that is going to be a bit too many points to have to recover, though. Even with it killing some of the littler guys, the bulk of Drill's fleet is in his the largest ship, and I don't think the remainder of Laps's fleet is going to be able to put enough points on the board to bring that one back. Congratulations to Drills, though. Pulling off a pretty solid win. Even if a few of his ships are getting taken apart pretty systematically. Honestly, I think this antimatter ship, if it were paired with some just like spongy, disposable swarms, I think it would do very well. You can see its behavior is actually rather good. It generally tries to keep distance, it's keeping oriented, but it spends so much time trying to run away that it can't really apply damage the way that it is necessarily ideal. I think the big ship is 8k. I think that is half of Laps's submission. But with 8k you can build some pretty spongy ships to stand in front of it. But Drills took the match. So next up we have Drills against Starficz. And here might be a little bit harder for Drills' fleet. All the long-range cannons are going to be easily keeping their distance from Drills' fleet. For the most part, Drills has a durable but not terribly agile submission. He does have the missile ship, as you can see, running off in the distance, but the missile ship itself is fairly fragile, and when it comes to long-range, fragile fights, Tinker will just have an inherent advantage. And I think that might come into play, which is unfortunate for Drills, but rather good news for Starficz. As you can see, a pretty solid point lead in Starfix's favor. It does appear that Starfix's fleet is having a difficult time actually applying enough damage to kill the distractors. But I think the fleet in general is moving slow enough that that won't be an issue. But against a slightly faster fleet, I think that might be a problem for Starficz. We'll see how it plays out. Yeah, though there is a pretty noticeable point lead, I think Starficz focused largely on range and rate of fire, and that's leaving his damage a bit lackluster. You can see the muzzle velocity on those cannons is tremendous, as is the rate of fire on them. But what ends up happening is it has to fire in those bursts because it's draining its entire generator reserve in an instant. And each individual shot is not terribly potent. It just puts a lot of shots on the field. But Starficz does take round one. using the range and mobility to his advantage. One of his ships getting caught out by a torpedo volley, though. That's, torpedoes are really good against pretty much everything that they hit. Usually that's the hard part with tank roll, is actually hitting them with the torpedoes. But the ship kind of turned sideways chasing one of Drill's distractors and ended up getting pretty devastated. As for full-time length, I would wager that against anything that isn't squishy, we'll probably be going to time with Starficz's fleet. So probably most of them. And with the last few seconds on the clock ticking down, it looks like we're going to be seeing Starficz take the match. And next up we have Drills up against Splinter. One of the bigger assets Splinter had in his previous match was that the opponent just didn't have very many ships. Unfortunately for Splinter's fleet, that's not the case this time, but the distractors from Drills aren't a terribly large threat in and of themselves. However, they did manage to get one of the ships to stop spinning, and in a blaze of glory, one of Splinter's ships has been destroyed. Those plasma cannons just cutting through Splinter's defenses. And Drills takes round one. Splinter ship surviving the initial torpedo volley rather well. I don't think any of the torpedoes actually managed to connect on the previous round. But those plasma cannons are just too much, I think. Combined with the fact that Drills' smaller ships did manage to get Splinters to stop spinning. And Drills takes the match. At least it was a quick death. But next up we have Flypaste up against Drills. And Flypaste was saying that the mines actually do a lot more of his damage than we were thinking. Which, I could kind of see that, but in the face of having 2 proton swords on each ship, I think, while the mines may be significant, I think the proton swords are probably more significant still. Farmers don't die, they just go upstate to live on the farm. I don't believe the AI responds to mines at all. I think it just pretends that they're not real. Yeah, they are missiles, but they don't have any or any thrust or anything. I think once they come to a stop, the AI doesn't even acknowledge their existence. But if you'll excuse me, I'm going to have to step away for just a moment. And I'm back. Looks like we have a 1-to-1. And here in the third round, you can see Drills is off to a really strong start, building up a pretty big point lead. Fly ships seem to be having a little bit of a tough time with the maneuvering, which we often see with ships that have predominantly forward thrust. They'll charge forward, bump into the enemy and start spinning out of control, and they don't have the ability to stop themselves from continuing to spin. But with this kind of point lead, I'm pretty confident that round 3 is going to go in favor of Drills. Yeah, only 30 seconds left. I feel like this point discrepancy is not going to be something Flypaste's fleet is going to be able to turn around. Pretty solid match here in the third round though, but a whole lot of ballet and not a lot of fighting. And Drills takes the match. So up next we have Husk up against Lapsapnow. Laps's antimatter ship should have a pretty easy time actually outrunning its opponents, but unfortunately the disrespect behavior you can see caused the antimatter ship to charge right in the beginning, which is less than ideal for Laps's fleet. The disrespect behavior essentially. The distractors from Husk are so inexpensive that the game determined that it was below a certain threshold of cost relative to Laps's ship, and as a result it decided to charge in full force because, you know, how could a cheap ship be of any value against an expensive ship? It certainly couldn't just be a distraction or a sponge. So the game decided to execute the disrespect behavior, and when you disrespect your enemy, bad things almost always happen. And Husk takes on 1. And again, we see Laps's antimatter ship demonstrating that disrespect behavior, charging in on the distractors. And because of the positioning here, it's just going to charge right back in. Eventually it's going to find itself surrounded, I think. In the meantime, the one of Laps's ships goes down, the one with the spaced armor. A remarkable display of violence coming out of Husk's fleet. A ton of projectiles on the front of the ship from Laps, though. You can see sort of along right behind the angled antimatter cannons, there is a pile of defense cannons on the ship on either side, and the defense cannons don't seem like it, but they actually do rather good damage, especially relative to their cost. They're not quite laser efficient, but they are quite a bit longer range than lasers, and of course much smaller and lighter. pretty solid weapons, the defense cannons. And there again we see the disrespect behavior. It really kind of is the bane of anyone trying to build a large ship. Because of disrespect behavior, it's very difficult to build a large ship that tries to fight at range, because the AI will almost always end up falling for the disrespect. However, inexpensive ships work well at long range, but their armaments are, by necessity, very limited. And Husk takes the match. Next up we have Husk up against Starficz. I think this is going to be a very difficult match for Starficz. He might win on points, but I don't think he's going to be able to kill any of the large spinners. Although with his ships turning around and getting caught out, that didn't go too terribly this time, but it might in the future. And yeah, the little guy always wants something. Right now he's got zoomies, I'm not really sure why. And just like that, now he's lying down and taking a nap. He has the weirdest life. Oh, nope. Are we back to zoomies again? No, no, good, good. Although, perhaps I'm about to be proven wrong. It looks like one of Husk's spinners is very low on health. Getting reduced to almost nothing. However, it does not take long for ships to regrow, so if Starficz's ships end up getting distracted, then it should recover fairly quickly. And in a surprising moment in the last 30 seconds, you can see Husk has taken about a 400-point lead. He must have caught one or two of Starficz's ships out. And the regrowth rate on Sentinel armor is pretty standard. Although if you're used to Terran regrowth rate, Sentinels are going to feel like they regrow very slowly, but a lot of that stems from the fact that Terrans just are the fastest regrowing faction in the game. But Husk takes the first round on points, and I believe he had no casualties on his side. And Sentinel armor will regrow more slowly than Terran armor, but it's also more potent armor once it does regrow. I think overall hit point recovery is about the same. Hey, FGD. And here it looks like we're seeing very similar to the last match where the Tinkerel ships are slowly approaching the wall while Husks are trying to close in. Husk fleet is definitely built more around dealing with brawling sorts of engagements, which doesn't really do one any favors against Tinkerel. But with the fleets kind of pinching this cluster of Tinkerel ships on the wall to the right, that could go very poorly for Starficz's fleet very quickly. It shouldn't take more than a couple volleys from any one of these spinners to kill a ship outright. The Tinkerel shields are some of the better shields in the game, but even then they can only take so much damage before they get knocked out. Yeah, I can zoom into the minefield. You'll be able to see it on YouTube because of the higher quality, but Twitch limits the amount of bandwidth that streamers can use, and so, you know, the loss in quality kind of rears its ugly head when you're dealing with the minefields like that. But I'll zoom in on it. That should let you see it. And again, we see Husk managed to catch a couple of the larger ships from Starficz out, building up a point lead and taking the match in the last few seconds. And Flypaste, I didn't check yours against the time dilation rule at all because it was a last minute submission and I didn't really have time. But now we have Eyes the Storm by Splinter up against Husk's fleet, and here we can see the wonderful disrespect behavior yet again, except this time I think it's particularly bad. The farmers really cannot be in brawling range against Sentinels. The Sentinels are just... they're built for brawling, and farmers are not. It is definitely a Sentinel environment. Although that said, the farmer ships are holding up a lot better than I had expected. Those Bolsheviks cutting through the distractors pretty quickly, but with one of Splinter's ships going down, I think it's only going to be a moment or a few moments before we see the other one join it. And Husk takes round one. A solid showing by Splinter, but farmers I think are just at too much of a disadvantage for this match to go in Splinter's favor. And Husk has been kind of on a roll in the subpool here. The farmers actually might not be that weak to mines. I'm not really sure. I forget how much damage per second the mines deal, but the farmer spinners are all hiding under 3 of the large farmer shields. So, granted, at the points where they overlap, you'll probably hit 2 or 3 of them pretty consistently. But they're not going to just spontaneously combust. It's going to take quite a few mines before they actually go down. Also, the scatter cannon point defense might be a problem for the mine layers. And Husk takes the match. So next up we have Husk up against Flypaste. So let's give it a little bit and let the minefield build up. In the meantime, you can see Flypaste rushing pretty hard. The distractors holding up pretty poorly against the mines, but a lot of that has to do with just the blast radius. The mines themselves have a very large blast radius for their cost, and here you can kind of see how the minefield stacks up. So anyone but Flypaste moving through the minefield, I think it's 100 damage per mine or something like that. I don't really remember. But Husk is, his spinners are pretty much immune, I think, to Flypaste's ships. The lasers will do quite a bit of damage, but their outer radii are too large for the mines to get any internals. In the meantime, that then forces Flypaste's ship into brawling range, which is exactly what Husk's fleet wants. The mines will auto-detonate over time, but it's kind of like any other missile. They just more or less time out. And solid round one in Husk's favor. Husk looking very strong in this pool. And Husk takes round one. Moving in round two, I'm expecting very similar here. The distractors are relatively easy for Flypaste's fleet to destroy, but the spinners are too large and too dangerous, I think. And yeah, they are fairly easy for Flypaste's fleet to destroy, but they're spending a lot of their time attacking the spinners. The spinners, I think, are more mobile than the distractors, and after a little while, there's just not enough ships left on the field for Flypaste's fleet to have the damage to break Sentinel armor. It's kind of a relative thing, but Husk takes the match, and that's Husk securing his place in the finals. So let's see how the rest of it goes. Here we've got Laps up against Starficz. I don't think this one's going to go terribly well for Laps's fleet. For the most part, Starficz struggles with heavily armored opponents, but Laps's fleet isn't as heavily armored as some of the other submissions in the pool. And you can see the larger ship from Laps already down. It tries to fight at range against Tinkerel, which doesn't generally work out. Tinkerel are the undisputed masters of long-range combat. as Starficz takes round 1. And no, unfortunately there is no free-for-all. If I knew how to, it's possible I could create one in the sandbox, but I don't know if the commands even exist to make something like that happen. Though I would like to be able to do that, that would be very interesting. Yeah, Starficz. It's like Netflix, except Starficz and Chill generally involves a lot of long-range projectiles. And Starficz takes the match. So next up we have Laps up against Splinter. Let's see how this goes. Not sure, I think Splinter may actually have the advantage here. Laps's fleet does have quite a bit of damage output, but it's rather fragile. And you can kind of say the same thing for Splinter's submission, courtesy of its being farmer. But Splinter's ship handled the what I think is the bulk of the raw DPS for Laps's fleet, and took that off the field pretty handily. And with only one ship left on the field, I'm feeling pretty confident that Splinter's going to be taking round 1 at the very least. Yeah, they might be different factions. I'm not sure. I know in the sandbox you can create, or you can run the agent command to spawn agent fleets, and I'm not entirely sure how it manages that. If it was a faction reassignment thing where you could just like change the faction number but keep all the block stats the same, that would be possible. Another big thing is in tournament mode, all the ships have the attack flag, which causes them to constantly seek out nearby targets, whereas the sandbox fleets will just kind of meander around until they come in range of an enemy, sort of behaving the way they do in the campaign. If there was going to be a free-for-all tournament, I would want them to have the attack flag so that, you know, we don't run into a situation where ships are just kind of idle toward the fringes, which would allow me to, say, start ships in the corners, you know? Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that it's a doable concept. I'd like to be able to. A free-for-all tournament would be pretty interesting, I think, and would certainly be something I'd be interested in looking at. But I'm not entirely sure the commands exist to make it happen. But we have round 1 going in favor of Splinter, and a pretty solid round 1. Both of his ships managed to survive through the entire fight. But they do need to do something about that larger ship from Laps's fleet. If it stays on the field, you can see it's got the plasma cannons and the proton beams. The Splinter ships will only be able to endure that kind of fire for so long. But they did manage to knock it off the field, and so I think we're going to see more or less a repeat of what we saw last time, where Splinter fleet, I think, is going to be taking round 2 as well. Well, alright, so the agent command grabs fleets from the wormhole server. I could probably do some host spoofing to have it grab fleets from me the way that I want it to, but we'd have to know the protocols the way that the game handles them normally. And I'm not sure how it goes about doing that. I know the agent fleets are just in gzip Lua files on the wormhole server, but I'm not sure what sort of information is passed back and forth. May have to run I might be able to dig into it a little bit, but it's starting to sound like a lot of effort. And Splinter takes the match. So up next we have Laps against Flypaste. I'm feeling like Flypaste actually has the advantage here. Although Laps has mines of his own, which fighting fire with fire here, I suppose. But you can see the mines making pretty short work of Laps's spaced armor, and the proton swords doing what proton swords have done once or twice in the past. Yeah, it's looking very solidly in Flypaste's favor here. The last ship managing to not take any damage so far, but I don't think that's going to be the case for too much longer, as Flypaste's fleet slowly but surely surrounds it. The valiant last stand working out rather well for Laps though, but it can only last for so long. And I think we're going to see basically what we saw last time, where Laps's ship just eventually gets surrounded and pinched. A valiant boat, this last guy, but I think he's just in a situation for which he does not have enough answers. So that, Laps calls it the South African spaced armor, and the idea behind it is to absorb explosive harassment and minimize the amount of actual damage that it takes, while keeping weight down so that you don't have to invest as heavily in thrusters. But now we have Splinter up against Starficz, and unfortunately for Splinter, I don't see this going well for the farmer fleet. I think they're a little too soft, and Starficz kind of specializes in killing soft. And Starficz taking round one. And in a very similar fashion, it looks like we're going to see Starficz taking round two as well. Tough break for Splinter, but a really good showing. However, it's just, you can only do so much with farmers. But here we've got Flypaste up against Starficz. I feel like Starficz does have the advantage here, though. Flypaste fleet is very fast, but they're not well controlled. And I think the impact from the projectiles out of the Tinker fleet is going to have a pretty profound effect. Although, as I say that, I underestimate the proton swords, and the proton swords do what they do every time I underestimate them. And it looks like, unfortunately for the farmers, they are continuing their tradition of not making it into the champion pool. So fun fact, in all of the years that I've been running the tournament, and it is years now, the farmers are the only faction who have never made it into a tournament or into the champion pool in a mixed faction tournament, or the like the standard format where any faction is allowed. The farmers are the only ones that have never made it. Even the Reds have made it into the champion pool, but farmers have never done so. And yep, 5 farmer entries out of 22 total entries for the tournament, and not one of them managed to make it into the champion pool. Even if I did allow the top 3 out of each subpool to make it to the champion pool, farmers still wouldn't make it. That is a faction that needs some help. And I can't even say that it's the like anyone designing the ship's fault. I think they're just at such a statistical disadvantage that no amount of effort will really help. Poor farmers. And Flypaste wins the match. So now we have Splinter up against Flypaste, which I believe means we need to figure out who between Drills and Starficz gets to go. These ships from Splinter holding up a lot better than I would anticipate. I was expecting the proton swords to more or less slice through everything, but it appears that Flypaste ships are trying to dodge something, and as a result they're essentially just harassing with the proton swords rather than committing and killing. It's probably the Bolsheviks, honestly, doing it. The Bolsheviks are pretty scary, and Flypaste's fleet can't really avoid them. Everything they've got requires them to get in Bolshevik range. And we can see Splinter doing a remarkably good job of taking things apart. As expected though, the scattergun point defense, where he's just got the farmer shotguns facing in every direction, is doing a very good job of keeping the minefield under control. And a solid round 1 going to Splinter. I think the relatively small size of Splinter ships is actually being an asset in this fight, because as you can see, Flypaste ships are just kind of running around in circles, bumping into each other, having a hard time actually getting into the fight. And part of that is that Flypaste has almost exclusively forward thrust. He has a little bit of backward and a little bit of turning, but it's almost all pointed forward. And we've seen that in the past pretty often, that when a ship overcommits on forward thrust, it ends up just doing ballet half the time. But the relatively small size of Splinter ships, I think, like I said, is not doing Flypaste any favors, because they are just tripping over themselves. And I think that's a little bit of shade from Splinter there. Thanking Flypaste for making the pool feel better, in Splinter's words. I think Splinter's just happy that he actually managed to get a win. That have not been enough of those. But it looks like between Flypaste or between Drills and Starficz, Drills won their head-to-head, and so whatever. I'm gonna take a look at the logs and see who's advancing. Thank you for joining us in the third subpool, and I hope you have a good one.